8 through 17 this morning. And this is what it says. It says, "If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violence of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and yet there is a higher one over them. But this is gain for the land in every way. A king commits to cultivate fields. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also vanity. When goods increased, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his own eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats a little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. There is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner's own hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is a father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. And as he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away with his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, and much vexation and sickness and anger." All right, so kind of recap where we're at with Ecclesiastes. Just to kind of give a review, because if we kind of just take this by itself, it doesn't make sense. If we just rip it out and read it, this is not one of those encouraging sections of this book as we discussed. But chapter 1, what we saw was really what Solomon said was there's a monotony of life, the repetitiveness of life. Life goes on, and it's just repetitive over and over. There's no end to life. And that's where he kind of opens up. And then he gets to chapter 2, and he starts trying to find out what is the purpose of life. What does it mean to live? How do I find joy and satisfaction? But the problem is, in chapter 2, he really tries to find joy and happiness in things outside of God. God's never mentioned, God's never brought up. So he has these great experiments, and we discovered as we studied in Solomon's life, he had more money than anyone else, he had more power than anyone else, and he had more wisdom than anyone else to do these experiments. So he was able to go to the extent that no one else in history could go to the extent of, because he had no limitations. So he tried to find joy and satisfaction in his wealth, in his projects, in women, in entertainment, and all these other things. And at the end, he just said, this is vanity at the end of that. Now in chapter 3, he kind of introduced God. This is where, again, this is this whole sermon. Ecclesiastes really just means it's a sermon. This is Solomon's sermon. And we're just kind of breaking his sermon down. It's meant to be read in one sitting. But in chapter 3, he goes, okay, if all this is vanity without God, and then he brings God into the picture, and he finds joy and happiness and satisfaction in God and the things that God provides. It's a change of perspective. So sometimes these things we talked about at the very beginning of this, it seems like there's times that he can seem very contradictive. In this section, he is, because if you read after what I've just read, he turns around and says, okay, money is good. Well, wait, I thought money was bad. It's all a matter of perspective. Again, he's bringing out the aspects of when is it profitable and when is it not profitable. And that's what he's doing here. So in chapter 3, he brings God into the picture, and for the very first time, he becomes God-focused. And in verse 11 of that, he says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in man's heart so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And he starts pointing us towards God. And remember, Solomon wrote this at the end of his life. So he did this after he turned his back towards God, searched after other gods from his wives, and now he's coming back to God at the end and saying, okay, I'm writing this for your instruction, for your guidance, for your benefit to not do what I did. And as we've seen as we've gone through this book, there's these peaks and valleys, and we're kind of in one of those valleys again here in chapter 5, where we talk about the reality of the broken world that we live in. That's what we talked about last week. In chapter 4, we really just took the whole sum of chapter 4, and Solomon's just saying, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. Well, what's bad? These things that are broken. We live in a broken world. And there's nothing we can do or say to change that, because we're not going to have this resolved this side of heaven, but he's saying these are the realities that we go through. This is the brokenness we're in. So last week what we did was, after we went through chapter 4, the common thought in our mind is, okay, if God is sovereign, if God's in control of all things, why does evil exist? And then beginning chapter 5, we addressed that, where basically at verse 1 it says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near is to listen. To listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know what they are doing is evil. And really is basically saying, listen, we are on earth, God's in heaven, let our words be few. Let's not question what God's doing. Why? Going back to that, verse 3:11, God makes everything beautiful in its time. And whose time? God's time, not ours. So he's emphasizing, listen, there's things that happen in this world that God makes everything, and the word everything includes the bad things, the broken things, and also the good things that we know are good, and he makes all those beautiful in his timing. And Solomon's saying, basically in chapter 5, beginning chapter 5, don't question God. Don't say, hey, God, I don't know what's going on here. I don't understand what's happening. And as we went through that, we discovered we tend to do what he calls dreams come with much busyness, meaning we daydream a lot. Well, if I have my situation changed, this is what my world would be like, or this is how it would be, and if God would do it this way, this is how much better it would be. And Psalmists don't do that. Why? Because God's going to make everything beautiful in his time. So then what he does is this, and from verses 8 all the way to the end of the chapter, it's really one theme. He starts bringing in the issue of money. And who better to talk about money than Solomon? Solomon had more money than we can imagine. Remember when we studied about Solomon's life at the very beginning, he said that gold and silver was like the rocks of the ground. It was so abundant. It was just everywhere. It was just plentiful. You go everywhere and find it. And so what Solomon now is addressing is the issue of money. And what he's going to say is, okay, here's the negative aspects from verses 8 through 17, what we're talking about today, the negative aspects of that, but then turn around and say what the positive aspects. And again, these are the perspectives of that. We look at it and go, okay, what is he talking about? What perspective he gives? You know, money could do strange things to people. A lot of people, it can make friends, enemies. Marriages have difficulties with marriage. People become discontent. And so many people spend so much time and effort with money, and Solomon did too, that he's kind of addressing this issue. How do we view money? How do we look at it? And the more money does not always equal more happiness. Yet our world and society teaches us that, right? If you just have this, you could be happy. And we're in kind of a season where, next week people are going to so-called go find their happiness by waking up at way before the sun rises and wait outside a store to go buy a special item they've waited all their life and fight people for. And we've seen all the videos of that, people fighting over the last toaster oven that's $5 at Walmart. Because if they don't get that thing, they're not going to be happy. And Solomon's basically saying that. We look at Solomon's life, and he amassed a massive fortune, yet he called it vanity, striving after the wind. So this morning what we do is Solomon's going to lay out two different evils that he sees about money. Next week he's going to show next week we'll get into the positive aspects of money. Again, it's all a matter of perspective. But in verses 8 and 9, we want to look at the oppression of the poor. Typically, money oppresses the poor. So let's read verses 8 through 9 once again. It says, if you see a province, the oppression of the poor, and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and yet a higher one over them. But this is the gain for the land in every way, a king committed to cultivate fields. Solomon's pointing out the fact that there's oppression. We talked about this earlier in chapter 4. If you turn back to 4 verses 1 through 3, Solomon says, again, I saw the oppression done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the other side, their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought that the dead, who have already been dead, more fortunate than the living who have been alive. But better than both is he who had not been and had seen the evil deeds done under the sun. And we looked at those verses, and the issue was there's a matter of fact that people will be oppressed due to the fallen nature of this world. That's what Solomon's saying here. He's reiterating here, this is going to happen. There will be oppression. And the issue in chapter 4 was not so much the issue of the oppression happening, but there was no one to comfort the oppressed. And the difficulties that occurs, that there was no one to comfort them. That was the emphasis of the text. No one was there to comfort them, and how he emphasized that. And we looked at that and said that was the main issue. Why in verses 2 and 3 says better that they'd been dead, not alive, because there's no one to comfort them. We looked at the New Testament perspective with Christ, and Paul pointed out that the church body is meant to help people through these difficult times, especially times of oppression, suffering for the sake of Christ. And so what happens is these people are being oppressed because of the world. And now Solomon brings it up again. He mentions rulers and authorities and has a direct revelation with wealth. Now, got to go back into the culture back at that day. Back then, rulers and leaders were not necessarily elected officials. They're typically not the ones who, go run for office. There's voting booths and things like that we have here in our democratic society. Back then, is basically you became a ruler or someone that was a leader or had direct connotation if you had money. So it was more by default, by the family you were born into, or the situation that you had, especially if you had land. And that was then the land would give you a significance of wealth back then. So these leaders were wealthy and had money, and typically back then the poor served the wealthy. That's how they would make their ends meet. The poor would go and cultivate the fields, and at the end of the day, whoever the foreman that oversaw this individual's wealth would pay them, and they would use that money to pay for their food. And that's why we read in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Literally, that's what it meant. You worked a day's work and you got enough money to pay for food for a day. That's how reliant you were. It wasn't like our society where you get paid weekly or monthly or whatever you do, and you kind of know you have a guaranteed cash flow coming as long as your job's around. Back then, it was like you literally you worked the field, you got paid, and that was enough money to feed your family for that given day. There was no savings accounts, per se. So what happened back then is because of this, the rich had all the power, the poor were subject, and the poor could be oppressed. Again, the oppression that was to crush down, to smash, to make them heartache. And that was what was going on back then. Solomon's basically just pointing out this fact that if you see this, where the poor is being violated by this, it's going to occur. It also happened in the courts, where the poor was a violation of justice and righteousness. In the matter of justice grinds slowly, and the poor cannot afford to do it. It's very similar to today. If someone is poor, they can't afford a lawyer. If a person that had a grievance against a major corporation wanted to go to court with them, that person could not afford the bills. Why? Because the corporation has all the money. They could pay for the lawyers. They already budgeted into their costs. Thus, the poor that way. So back then, if a poor person wanted to take a rich person to court, the rich person happened to win the court case. Why? Because they had money. That was the main reason why. Or they had influence. And typically the judges and the other people were, kind of in that same society, same social group. So they knew each other, but not the poor people. That's what Solomon's saying here. They had the ability to persuade judges with their money. And it's interesting what Solomon says. Solomon says this. He says, do not be amazed at the matter. Don't be shocked by it. I think we see the injustice that happens in our world, and we go, why does this continue to happen? Why do the courts still make these bad judgments? And all Solomon's doing is point a fact of life. We live in a broken world. The whole point of this book is we're not in the garden anymore. It's not going to be perfect. Justice is not going to be served. So how do we, as believers in God, in His case, in Christ, for our case as a church, how do we respond to these injustices? How do we trust in God in this? He makes the point that we should not be shocked at the results, and there's really nothing we could do to get rid of that. We see all the time that the people are oppressed, that justice is not served. And he's basically saying, listen, this is going to happen. So the question is, okay, so what do we want to solve problems, right? That's our desire. We're problem-solving people. We want to do things to solve the issue. So what do we do to do it? I mean, obviously in our society, we have a little more influence because we can vote. But at the end of the day, we still have to trust in God in the midst of that. And we're going to talk about that more in detail here in a few moments. But we have the ability to have justice to a certain extent. But just understand, it's never going to be just. The court systems are never going to be right. Why? Solomon says they're not going to be fixed in this broken world. So when we see it in the news, we see it in some people's lives, in a church body or your own, where you go to court and injustice is not served. Remember who's in charge of that. God's still sovereign. He's still on the throne. And he's going to use those injustices in our own lives or other people's lives to serve his purpose and his glory. I mean, you can think about it. What was the biggest court case that had the biggest injustice ever? It was Pilate, right? Pilate's going, hey, Jesus is not guilty. I don't want this to happen. And his wife comes in and says, hey, this guy's not guilty. He thinks, hey, I'll just have this great thing. I'll get Barabbas to come up here, and they'll choose between Jesus and Barabbas. And we know what we're going to choose, and they actually chose the one he didn't intended. They chose Jesus. Why? God's purpose was to be fulfilled. God was using that injustice at that moment to serve a greater purpose. So in verse 9, he kind of gives an interesting perspective. He says this. It's kind of a weird verse, but we'll read it and kind of break it down. It says, but this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivate fields. Now, it's an interesting one. I'm reading for the ESV, and I'll read a couple of different translations, and we'll kind of look through this. In the NASB, it says, after all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. And the New English translation says this, kind of a paraphrase. The produce of the land is seized by all of them. Even the king is served by the fields. And so what this is kind of a Hebrew saying is this. Even though government is corrupt, even though there's injustice and there's oppression, there's still some purpose to this. That the government is broken, but there's still a purpose to broken governments. In this particular scenario, the fields are still cultivated. Food is still produced. The king still has money come into his coffers, even though unjustly, but there's still some byproduct that is beneficial to all involved. That's what he's saying. Even though this is not the best of situation, there's still a byproduct. Yeah, people are going to eat. Why? Because that's what people did back then. They worked the fields. The poor worked the fields. They didn't have jobs like we have today where we go into buildings and do a skilled trade or something like that, more white collar. They were all agrarian. They worked. And what Solomon's point is even though the government is broken, the society is broken, tyranny is better than anarchy. Even though this is an evil, it's a necessary evil. And God points this out throughout Scripture. Turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 13. I just want to show you a believer's perspective to government. It says this. In Romans 13, verses 1, it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except by God's appointment, and the authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Let's stop there. We'll keep on reading. What Paul's saying here is this. It's not a mistake that every government in the world has these leaders, from the most corrupt to the best. They've all been established by who? God, right? God has instituted. He goes on in verse 2. So that the person who resists such authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will incur judgment. For the rulers cause no fear for good, but conduct for bad. You desire not to fear authority? Do good, and you will receive this condemnation. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be in fear, for it does not bear the sword in vain. It is God's servant to administer retribution on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of the wrath of the authorities, but also because of your conscience. For this reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants devoted to governing. Pay everyone what is owed, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. So here Paul is basically saying government has a purpose. God has instituted and made every governing authority, from the most wicked to the best in this world and throughout history. God has ordained these people. The main reason why he's ordained these people is for his purpose and his glories. He's looking towards eternity. He's looking towards Christ coming back and ruling and reigning. And some people say, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would he do that? Well, we read Revelation and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We see the rise of Antichrist. Regardless of your political views of our current administration or past administrations, or any administration in the world for that matter, the Antichrist can make all these and all dictators look like angels. I mean, you read Revelation, what he does, and what he doesn't, and 1st Thessalonians and 2nd Thessalonians, he's going to make the worst of the worst look beautiful. I mean, that's how bad he's going to be. Yet God is doing that for his eternal purposes. And so the point of the book, the text is Solomon saying is, listen, I know they're an evil, but they're a necessary evil. This is the reality of how government is. And he's so frank and honest about that government cannot be fixed. We see in the book of Daniel, in Daniel 22:21, and also through the whole book, but kind of one of the main themes of the book of Daniel is God raises up kings and he brings kings down. Why? For his purpose and his glory. That's kind of the whole point of the book of Daniel. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys and Jerusalem, drags off the whole nation of Israel into captivity. And the book of Daniel is basically a testament to the people in exile. God's in control. He has a plan. He has a purpose. And we see the story of Daniel's life. It's like 40 plus years of his life unfold. And things are just working for what? God's glory. Because after the Babylonian situation disappeared, we have the Medo-Persians coming down and destroying Babylon, right? We see, and God shows this vision to Daniel of this big statue with different parts to it. The Medo-Persians come down, they destroy it, and what do the Medo-Persians do? They let the Israelites go back to home and rebuild their temple, right? And then we see, it talks about the Greeks, and then that story is about the Greeks, and then finally the Romans come, when the Roman society actually helps allow the gospel to go forth and populate the Mediterranean area. So even though there's some bad things that come out of government, and there's the oppression of the poor, there is a necessary benefit to that. And again, going back to chapter 5, what is God doing? God knows what he's doing. We don't. And this world's broken. So that's what he's saying. And then from verse 10 to the end of this section, in verse 17, Solomon shifts gears that basically, so money can lead to oppression and bad government, but it doesn't satisfy people in life. And no better person to talk about than who? Solomon. He had the money. So in verse 10, he talks about this. He says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. It's interesting that he brings this up in the New Testament. Money is talked more than heaven and hell, more than God and his kingdom. Why? Because Jesus knew that where our heart is, where our treasure is, that's where our desires will be. If we love money, then that's our heart and desire and treasure. What Solomon's saying here is you'll never be satisfied with money. Solomon had firsthand experience. The old saying goes, how much is it enough? It was just a little bit more, right? You see the richest people in the world, and they just keep on wanting to get more and more money. Why? That's just innate in their sinful nature. They just want it. They think it's going to satisfy them, and it never does. You notice that he does not say to possess money is evil. He doesn't say that. Again, he emphasizes the word loves twice. He loves his wealth. He loves his money. That word, the Hebrew, is a deep-seated emotion to desire something, to want it. But the love of money leads to all kinds of problems. This person will never be satisfied with their wealth. And again, he points out the word vanity. And I'll use this illustration again and again throughout this book. Vanity is not what we think in the English language. The Hebrew word for vanity means momentary joy there for a second. It's there. It's like our coffee this morning. Today's a great day. If you had a cup of coffee and you walk outside, look, that mist that comes off. I like to use the illustration of a blow pop. Again, blow pops, you eat them, they taste great until you get to the middle. You chew that pink stuff in the middle, and then about 2 minutes later, you have to spit it out. And that's why they give blow pops in big bags, because why you need another blow pop to get the nasty pink gum taste out of your mouth. That's what Solomon's using here. He's saying it. He's not saying it's nastiness. It's just his vanity. It doesn't satisfy. You have to keep on doing it over and over and over and over again, and it never satisfies you. So now he's bringing in money, and he gives some practical reasons why money never satisfies. Verse 11 talks about the more you have, the more people will come after it. This is what it says in verse 11. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? What happens when you get more money? You get more friends. You get more people that want your money. Salesmen don't go after the poor. They don't go play golf with the people that can't help them on the range. They want to go with people with money. Solomon no doubt had this problem that people were just enjoying him for their own money. In fact, he wrote in Proverbs 14:20, says, "The poor is disliked even by his neighbor, but the rich has many friends." Why? Well, guess what? If you have money, guess what? People tend to like you for the wrong reasons because of your money. They want some action. They want some benefit of your money. They want to be around you and partake of your riches. And so Solomon's saying, listen, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. Meaning, back then, if you had more goods and more stuff, guess what? You had to hire more people to keep care of your goods and your stuff and everything else. And more people wanted to have a part of it. There was no advantage. It was this endless cycle of getting more money but never having enough to take care of the bills. One of the things that some of you guys know, I work in the financial sector, and we do financial updates on individuals. And it's interesting that you can look at some people's retirement plan if they have enough money to make it when they start retirement till the end, because we put that product out there. And there's people with millions of dollars, and you look at the way they live, and they don't have enough money to live through retirement. Why? Because they say, yeah, they have the high level, they have the home, they have the cars, they have high levels of debt, and they have millions in their retirement, but that millions will never last. You see a blue-collar worker who just diligently works, save money, and they have more money than they know what to do with, because they're frugal. They've learned to live that way their entire lives. They leave a estate to their family because why? Because they lived at humble means, or they didn't live beyond their means. That's what Solomon's saying here. He's basically saying, listen, the more you have, the more people come after it in different ways. And then verse 12, he says, the more you have, the more you worry about it. He says, sweet is sleep of a laborer, whether he eats a little or much, but the full stomach of the rich he will not let him sleep. He gives two aspects of this verse. The first aspect is working hard for an honest wage helps you sleep at night. Again, agrarian society. When you went out and you worked the field, you got your day's pay, guess what? You didn't have much free time. You didn't have much time to go do fun things at night. In fact, they didn't do much at night because they didn't have electricity. But you're tired. You went to bed. You fell asleep. This is one of the reasons why I believe young boys, especially the high school years, they need to do hard labor. Why? Get that energy out of them. Help them sleep at night. We live in a society where that doesn't happen. What happens? They don't go to sleep. They stay up late at night. And that's what Solomon's saying here. You work hard, you sleep well, but there's a second aspect of that is the more money you have, it won't let you rest at night. Now, there's two ways of looking at this, and it's kind of hard to see which way it really is. So I'll just give both of them. The first way is that if you have a full stomach at night, you don't sleep. It could be that if you eat too much, you've all been there, we'll probably be there, 4 days away, Thanksgiving. You eat too much and you can't rest well. You kind of have to loosen the belt. If back then, if you ate too much, guess what? You're not sleeping too well. There wasn't Tums. There wasn't anything to take afterwards. You just kind of had to deal with it. So there's some aspect that if you have too much food, you don't sleep well. But the word full stomach actually comes from the root word in the Hebrew to be satisfied. So it almost could be translated this way, but the wealth of the rich will not allow them to sleep. What happens to people who have a lot of money? They stay up late and worrying about losing their money. They worry about, a market collapsing or their investment failing or their house being destroyed or anything. You just feel it. They sleep worrying about their money. So that's what Solomon's saying. Listen, you might, if you have more money, it could potentially not let you rest well at night. Now he's going to see, again, the antidote's going to be at the end of this chapter. He's going to go to the other perspective, but he's showing again, these are the problems of money. He's going to show the realities of it next week. Then in the next verse, he says, the more money you have, the more you can hurt yourself holding on to it. Verse 13. He says, there is a grievous evil that I've seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his own hurt. Now, Solomon already addressed this issue of a person who worked hard and had nowhere to put his money. Back then, typically, people work hard to help out their kids, to have a succession, to give an inheritance. In Ecclesiastes 4, verse 7 and 8, we talked about this. Solomon said, So I again considered another futile thing on earth, a man who was all alone with no companion. He had no children, no siblings, yet there was no end to all his toil. And he was never satisfied with riches. He laments, For whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This is also a futile and burdensome task. He kind of circles back again. I think there's kind of a little bit of introspective reasoning here with Solomon. He did have kids, but he's kind of thinking, my kids aren't the greatest. We talked about that with Rehoboam, his son, who took the throne. He didn't do a good job. He did a poor job. But he's talking about, again, this person who amasses wealth and does nothing with it. He hurts himself to his own end and destroys himself. Why? Because there's no benefit. He's just accumulating wealth. Here Solomon comes full circle what he described back in chapter 4. He's talking about the situation where he did have this money, but he was not able to go ahead and enjoy it. He's lamenting that someone else is going to have it. He's going to be all alone. And he's thinking to himself, why did I amass all this wealth? Why did I get all this wealth and gold and silver for what purpose, to what end? And it only harms him. It kind of reminds me of what Christ said in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21, talking about how this rich man was wanting his father's inheritance so desperately, and he just thought that would satisfy him, that would satisfy his life. But Solomon says it doesn't. It doesn't. He says the love of money is vanity. It never does satisfy you in that situation. So that's what he's doing here. He's saying that the more you have, the more it'll hurt you if you control and you want it. You want to be that miser and amass all this wealth and have it, but it really doesn't benefit you. Well, the other reason why money doesn't satisfy as well is the more you have, the more you are able to lose. You see in verse 14 it says, those riches were lost in a bad venture, and he is his father's son, and he has nothing in his hand. He's referring again to someone that has a lot of riches, but it can lose all of it. If someone was to have, say, $100 and they will lose 30% of their assets, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, that's $30. If you made a bad investment, you lost $30. But someone has $100 million, you lose 30%. That's a little different story. That's $30 million. So the more money you have, the more chances you can lose. You can lose it in a bad investment, a bad deal, a bad business transaction. But here he's saying it does not happen that way. The opposite is true, that you could lose all of your wealth. Think about that. If you don't have much and you're able to basically not have it stolen, but if somebody were to steal a rich person's assets, that there's a lot to lose. It took a lot of time to acquire all that and get it. So the more you have, the greater chances you're losing it, and therefore you don't love it. Another example, what Solomon brings up of why money never satisfies, the more money you have, the more you will leave behind. Verses 15, 16. He says, and he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again. Naked he came, and shall take nothing from the toil that he has carried away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? No one takes their wealth with them. We see this. You can't take it with you. When you die, your assets go on to your loved ones or to whoever your estate is. Paul echoed this in 1 Timothy 6:7. He says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. The saying goes that you'll see a hearse, but you don't see the U-Haul. You can't take your possessions with you. And Jesus emphasized the fact that, listen, this money is for temporal use. It's used so that you can use it for the benefit of others. There's a stewardship aspect in there. Christ says where your heart is, where your money is, your heart will be also. And you have to be able to use your money in a way to basically help out life. But Solomon's saying no, the more you have, the more you leave behind. And how you do that? Well, some people think if they keep on acquiring wealth and get more and more wealth, that'll make it satisfy them. But then the sad reality is that it doesn't. It really doesn't help you. You don't put hope in the earthly treasures because you can't take them with you. And the final aspect that Solomon brings up here, how money doesn't satisfy you, is this. The more you have, the lonelier you could be. Verse 17. Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness and much vexation and sickness and anger. There's an aspect, if you're rich, you become lonely. And Solomon's coming full circle with the idea. We talked about this a little earlier. The more money you have, potentially, the more people that you're around you become your friends. People who want a piece of your estate, a piece of the money. Well, he's saying basically the real outcome is really you're lonely. You don't have any true friends. There's no one around for them. That was found in verse 11. And it seems what happens is the more you have money, you really become the lonelier you become. Because why? Well, true friendship is hard to find. You always think about, well, is this person be my friend because I'm wealthy, or want to get to know me because they want some kickback or some kind of benefit of being my friend? And they become true lonely. So what we see here at the end is that riches really don't help you. And it really doesn't acquire satisfaction in life. The more money you have actually doesn't really help you. And that's what Solomon's talking about here. He's talking about there's some benefits to money, but some things that are not so beneficial. You're not able to do certain things. And really what he's talking about is a heart issue. How do you view wealth, and how do you view the riches that the Lord has given to you? Because in the end is this. If you're not able to do with the resources and be a good steward of what God has given you, you're not able to glorify Him in your wealth, then it's vanity, it's vain. And the issue is not the money itself, it's the love of money, as we've talked about. It's being able to do what God intended to do, being able to do what God wants us to have through that money and be a good steward to help His kingdom and expand the gospel. So what Solomon doing is basically summarizing. He's wrapping this section up at verse 17. He says basically, listen, if you put your hope in money, it won't satisfy you. But then in verses 18 through 20, we'll see this next week. In 18 through 20, he kind of flips the script here. He turns things around, and he starts to talk about what the things can do and help you and give you the ability to enjoy it. That's what he's doing here. He's basically saying, hey, money's not evil. It's the love of money that's evil. It's putting the hope in the money and the wealth to satisfy you. And what Solomon's going to do is this. He's going to flip the script on us, and he's going to turn around, okay, now, with a proper context, what I'm going to do is this, I'm going to be able to show you how to use money to enjoy that in God and be able to have satisfaction not in the money, but in God, and be able to enjoy that. That's what he's going to say in verses 18 through 20. He opens up, he says, behold, I see what is good and fitting. And he talks about eating and drinking and finding enjoyment in your toil. And he goes on and talks about this. So as we've gone through these verses together, Remember that it's the love of money that's the problem. Trying to find satisfaction in that money, that is the problem. And what Solomon's going to do is, next week, as we look at this, is going to be able to see how, as a believer, we can enjoy the things that God gives us, that gives Him the glory that God gives us for our good to enjoy while we're here on this broken earth.